you?
No. You would see, right now, there's only one participant, which is us.
All right. All right.
So why don't you introduce, but then we can cut and use this.
Right, absolutely.
So why don't you introduce Jane and then we'll go from there.
My name's Ayana. Yeah, okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. We're doing our blood pressure self-monitoring nutrition talk. We have two guest speakers today. One of them is Ayana, who is working with Just Fruits. Just Fruits is a local farm that sells farm shares and does a million other things. And the other person I'd like to introduce is Adele Seacrest, who is almost graduated from UMass degree in nutrition. She can talk a little bit more about that. And we're going to talk about plant-based diet. So it's a different spin than what we usually do. All right, you take it away.
Thank you. I love plant-based diets. I also do a plant-based diet, so it's nice to see you about that. But yeah, I'm from Just Fruits, and I just started out as a community engagement coordinator. So for me, that means that I am wanting to bring people onto the farm and really get them involved in the farm programming as much as possible, and also really make sure that like what we are making is accessible to people and like welcoming and fun for you to get involved. You so understand that like making a switch to a plant-based diet or like making a commitment to cooking with a lot of fruits and vegetables is like a complete change for a lot of people, or not something that they are used to. And we want to make that as easy and accessible as possible for people of all different sorts of ability levels. And whether that is coming onto the farm to get vegetables, getting a share, you can get a CSA share that we have for the summer that goes through the fall, and we also have a winter CSA share that extends through May. So almost the full year you can get a box offering from us, and if that is too much, we also have like some market options too, where you can just walk up and pick out vegetables that you can explore and try. And we have a lot of conventional stuff that you would normally see in a grocery store, and then we also have things that you may have never seen before, like a celeriac, which is like a root vegetable that tastes like celery and it looks like a goblet. So celeriac, yeah, which is a root vegetable, but it's not. It's different from the celery plant. Yeah. So we have so many different things, and we also have volunteer hours that are really accessible. We have a farm volunteer program that runs on Thursday mornings called Farming People, and its whole thing is being accessible for physical abilities. So we want to see a lot of different people come on, and we really want to commit to making farming and farm knowledge and access to the bountiful harvest of farm as accessible and easy for people to really be engaging. So, do you have any questions?
Things you get in your CSA.
Yeah, so it depends on the season, and through the season, it depends on what we're harvesting. So we really try to encourage seasonal eating and trying to teach what that means, especially for our region in the Northeast. So at this time of year, we have a lot of greens, we have radishes and beets coming up, we have carrots, we have some different kinds of broccoli. I just went to the market this morning at the Greenfield Market, which we sell walk up. You can walk up and get whatever vegetables that you want. I was just there. We had salad garnished with beautiful fennel and chive flowers. We had some different sorts of bok choy variations that are really good cooking greens. Yeah, we had some salad greens. So in your CSA box, you get like a variety of all of that. And how we run our CSA programs through the summer season, especially, is we keep it market style. So your CSA, you can get, you get to choose what you want out of the variety that we offer for your CSA offering, or you can get a box delivered to your house if like you can't get to town, which is where we do some different CSA pickups. We have one in the middle of the week on Thursday in town at the writing. We also are at different markets in town through the week, and then we also might go on to the farm on Saturday. So we have volunteer hours then as well, and the farm is just also like a wonderful place. Love seeing people come in. Like, yeah. Have you guys ever been out there, or like have you been involved?
Out where?
At Just Roots?
No, I haven't been there.
No?
No.
It's right up the road near Layden on Glenville Drive.
Right.
It's really nice with community gardens too. And I just started birding and it's a beautiful place to go look for birds. It's evening.
Come closer to, just so they can hear you,
Of
and
course.
maybe if you feel it, yeah, just so,
Yeah.
yeah, project a little bit.
Yep. Anything else you guys want to I just want to stand in front.
That's fine, I'll with that. I can hear you.
Oh, beautiful. No? Okay, I think we're good. I'm so excited for you to talk about this stuff.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you
So
guys.
yes, you can just move closer over there to the mic setup, yeah, and project. Yes, I know, I saw that, that's why they called us and said about, yeah, you can take that off, yep, all right, we're good.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's interesting to address people in person and on Zoom. So I wanted to talk a little bit about myself before I jump into our presentation today, just to sort of give you a background and why I'm involved in this sort of thing, where sort of my knowledge base comes from. So I became interested in plant-based diets actually for environmental reasons, and then I learned more and more about different research and different ways people have used plant-based diets to prevent and reverse certain chronic diseases that are really common in the US, things like heart disease and cancer. And I am studying nutrition at UMass in the dietetics track, so I'm planning on becoming a registered dietitian, which is essentially a person who counsels people one-on-one with a lot of credentials. I'm planning on going on and doing a dietetic internship, taking the registered dietitian's exam. And I've always had a focus on plant-based diets. I also ran the Plant-Based Nutrition Club at UMass for 2 years. And I also just really love to cook, and I've been getting into gardening, so just a little, and I've been getting more interested in sort of a community-based approach. So that's where I'm at right now. And for today's talk, I wanted to do a deep dive sort of into the research specifically on plant-based diets for hypertension. And so that's where we are. And I'm going to see how we change slides on here. I lost a tech person. I might just do it manually. Let's see. So I wanted to talk a little bit broadly about plant-based diets first, before I get too specifically into just hypertension. So the reasons to choose a plant-based diet sort of from a health perspective is they reduce inflammation. So plant-based diets have anti-inflammatory compounds, things like vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients and all these cool chemicals that interact in our bodies in very specific, very interesting ways that we're still learning to understand. And the plant-based diet has also been used to reverse heart disease. One of the biggest pieces of research that made me interested in going into nutrition was the Caldwell Esselstyn heart study. He took, I think, about a dozen people who had been told, you know, there's nothing more we can do for you. You have 6 months to live. Just go home and say goodbye to your loved ones. And he put them on a plant-based diet. Most of those people are still alive today, about 30 years later, which I think is really amazing. And, you know, people always talk about moderate changes, but I think when people are at such an extreme in life, they're willing to do whatever it takes, and that can be really amazing to see. And then plant-based diets also lower the risk of stroke by sort of the same mechanism by which they lower the risk of heart disease. Essentially, it's healthier for your arteries, you have better blood flow, and you have sort of less stuff building up. And then also lower risk of type 2 diabetes in a fully whole food plant-based diet, because you're eating actually fewer processed sugars and refined flours and that sort of thing. With a plant-based diet, we really emphasize eating whole plant foods, not just sort of like plant components or processed foods. And you also have a lower risk of chronic kidney disease, which is also really common in the US. It is essentially a problem of an overload of nitrogen from a diet high in meat, puts a really strong strain on the kidneys, which is why a plant-based diet that includes virtually no meat will be a lot healthier on your kidneys and will not take as much effort to digest.
Right.
And plant-based diets also slow down the aging process, so they provide things called antioxidants, which essentially affect the aging process and slow that down. And then plant-based foods also promote a healthy weight. So plant foods are naturally very low in calories, so you can essentially eat them in basically unlimited quantities, just eat until you feel full, and you're still going to be staying within limits without sort of worrying about how many portions are okay to eat, you know, how many calories are in this. You can generally trust fruits and vegetables aren't going to have very many. And I'm gonna just wonder if there's a way I could bring this up. So I wanted to talk about plant-based diets for hypertension and some of the research there. There's a lot of text on this slide. Okay, thank you. But essentially, just to overview some of the most interesting studies out there. There's a lot more research that goes beyond this, but it's the same research. Thousands of people. Seventh-day Adventists. Seventh-day Adventists are a religious group that's encouraged to generally eat fewer animal products. And so they're an interesting group to do comparisons on. Not every single Seventh-day Adventist adheres to a vegetarian diet, but they often do. And so essentially what they found in this Seventh-day Adventist study, I believe it was of about 5,000 people, is that vegans and lacto-ovo-vegetarians, so vegetarians still including dairy and eggs, had much lower systolic and diastolic blood pressure than their counterparts who were part of the same community, who were generally part of the same sort of cultural groups and had similar demographics. And this actually held true even when they compared for weight. So a lot of people know that having higher weight is a big risk for hypertension, but even when you compare people that have the exact same weight, one who's plant-based and one who's an omnivore, you generally have a better blood pressure pattern with a person who's of the same weight, but plant-based.
Right.
And then we also have the Cardia study. And so there they found that people that ate more plant-based foods, especially fruits, whole grains, and nuts, had lower blood pressure. And they found sort of a dose-dependent relationship. So more and more plant foods meant lower and lower blood pressure. And the opposite was what they found for animal-based foods. So the more meat they ate, the higher their risk of having high blood pressure. And this was a study of a very, there was, I think, at least a couple thousand. I'm blanking on the sample size exactly, but I can send it if anyone's interested after. And then there was the nurses' health study. This is actually a very broad study that encompassed a lot more than hypertension, but there was a specific report on what they found for blood pressure. And what they found was eating more red processed meat, poultry, and seafood created a higher risk of blood pressure, which I think is interesting because we often hear recommendations to cut out red and processed meat and switch to poultry and seafood. But a lot of people don't realize poultry is often an added source of sodium. A lot of chicken is injected with
When you
salt.
say processed poultry, would that be more like cold cuts of processed cold cuts?
Right, processed cold cuts or
Chicken,
things.
turkey,
Yeah,
those
things like,
poultry, but they're processed.
right, exactly. Or things like fried chicken could be an
Of
issue.
course, yes, that I know, yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it was interesting because I think a lot of people switch to poultry and seafood, which I think often has better outcomes than red and processed because it's plain.
It's plain, yeah,
Right,
or fix it you want, but no fry it or.
right, yeah, there are ways to prepare it that are healthier, you know, you can adjust it to work for yourself. And they even found an association with seafood. The main association with seafood was really canned tuna and salmon and sardines. So if you wanted to include some seafood in your diet, you would maybe want to stay away from the canned fish specifically. And then just talking broadly about sort of why this might happen, why plant-based diets could lower the risk of hypertension. They help open up the blood vessels. So hypertension is essentially a function of how your cardiac output, so how fast your heart beats and the pressure coming from your heart and how small your blood vessels are. So if your blood vessels are bigger, which is what a lot of what happens when you eat whole plant foods, then you have lower blood pressure. And then plants also provide antioxidants. So they also help stop plaque from building up. It's less sort of stress on the arteries. It also reduces inflammation, which helps your body fight off things. When you have less inflammation, you have lower risk of chronic disease. You also recover from illness better. And plant-based diets also feed good gut bacteria. Research about the gut microbiome has been getting really big in the past couple of years. Essentially, we've been realizing that a lot of our health outcome is related to the bacteria that live in our bodies for sort of superorganisms with like something like trillions of different kinds of bacteria living within us. And so it kind of comes out of what we're feeding these bacteria. And when we feed them a lot of fiber, which comes exclusively from plant foods, then they produce healthy compounds that help us in a variety of ways. And do we have any questions on this slide? It's sort of my wordiest slide.
Frozen berries, like say blueberries, that's just as good as the fresh blueberries.
Yes, it definitely is just as good as the fresh berries, and it is definitely going to be cheaper, which is great. The one thing you want to watch out for frozen berries is added sugar, which a lot of companies are pretty good now about labeling and making sure that you see that there's no added sugar in there. I mean, I'm pretty sweet enough. I don't really know why people add sugar to frozen fruit, but it is there sometimes. I think a lot of people are
Eat everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sugar, yeah.
Yeah, there's so much added sugar and salt in our
And
labels,
salt.
so be very careful about that. And any other questions before we move on? And then just check the chat, see if there are any questions on Zoom. Okay. And our next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what exactly a plant-based diet is. I've thrown this out a lot. I'm sure people have their own ideas or have heard about this in media. So essentially a plant-based diet emphasizes eating a lot of fruits, as we talked about. You can have frozen fruit, you can have fresh fruit. You just want to be careful about things with added sugars. So getting frozen fruits without added sugar, as well as avoiding sort of fruit canned in syrup, which is also a very common thing. And with vegetables as well, you want to be careful of canned vegetables and make sure they are canned, that you're rinsing them off, especially if they're kept in sort of a saltwater solution. But for the most part, you can eat fruits and vegetables in unlimited quantities. And then whole intact grains. A lot of people know whole grains are good for you, but they don't know to go so far as eating intact grains. So things like whole grain breads and pastas are great. They're much better than, say, refined breads and pastas. But what's even better is eating things that are sort of in their even less processed form, that look closer to how they exist in nature. So things like quinoa or barley or wheat berries or brown rice versus eating, whole grain bread and whole grain pasta, which is definitely an improvement. But you can go even sort of beyond that and eat grains in the way that they sort of look coming right off of the plant without going through any sort of milling or refining. And then we also have beans and legumes. Beans are especially interesting because they count both as a protein food and they count as a vegetable because they have such an overlap in the nutrients they contain without sort of some of the harmful compounds we find in meat products very often. So they'll have a lot of protein, they'll have a lot of iron, and they also have a lot of the nutrients we find in vegetables. So beans have this really interesting overlap. They're also really great for diabetes control. And I encourage everyone to eat as many servings of beans as possible. I think a lot of people don't realize beans are healthier included as a vegetable. And then we also have nuts. There's a lot of really interesting research with nuts for preventing heart disease. And nuts are a great source of vitamin E, as well as seeds for people that might have nut allergies. Obviously, if you have nut allergies, you shouldn't be eating nuts, but for people that don't, it can be really great. And you might notice that on this slide, I don't list numbers of servings a week or exact portion sizes, because these are foods that for the most part, you can eat as much as you want without really worrying about, have I had too many this week? I mean, eating a variety is great because you get lots of different nutrients from different foods. But at the same time, you're very unlikely to overeat broccoli or anything within that sort of vein. And some exceptions would be nut butters. You might not want to eat like more than, let's say, 2 or 3 tablespoons a day of something like peanut butter, especially if it has added oil or added salt. But for the most part, whole plant foods you can eat pretty much as you like. The other thing I would caution to not eat a crazy amount of would be things like oils. Oils do often have healthy fats, but they're also a very high source of calories, so there's sort of a trade-off there. And it's okay to have some, and it's definitely a better alternative to butter, but you don't want to, let's say, douse every single thing you eat in a ton of vegetable oil. And yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize other foods that they often eat are plant-based. Things like popcorn are a really great whole grain, as long as you're not, adding a ton of artificial butter or salt to it. We think of any foods that we like to eat or recipes we like to make that are already plant-based or just to be more plant-based. Any like meals or snacks you like to make that are plant-based or that can be made more plant-based? Just something you like to eat that has a lot of vegetable, whole grains, or whatever else in them.
Like plant-based soups.
Yeah, plant-based soups. That's a really great
I had
example.
one a while ago, when they gave me one. It was delicious, I was quite hungry.
Yeah, you can get a lot in there too. It's a really good way to mix everything that's in your pantry.
I'm not primarily a plant-based fan, but that was very good, I was surprised.
Yeah, there's some great soups out there. That's a really good option. Any other ideas?
I put a little flaxseed in my cereal, which is not a snack.
Yeah, flaxseeds are
Not a
great.
tablespoon, maybe half a teaspoon.
Yeah, that's funny. I actually put a slide coming up about flaxseeds. Yeah, flaxseeds are a really great source
The
of
cereal
omega-3s.
is terrible, it's so full of sugars and you have to. But this other little thing you don't have to eat that.
Yeah.
Good cereal.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also oatmeal, which is sort of a great alternative to cereal. It's got a lot of soluble fiber. It's pretty unprocessed, and you can also cook it pretty quickly. Are there any other thoughts on plant-based foods? We can always come back to it later. I was also gonna say I love just snacking on things like baby carrots or fruits in the morning. I'll grab mandarins with them, so they're easy to throw in a backpack and just kind of.
I'm snacking carrots and celery sometimes.
Yeah.
Especially this time of year.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure you would have much in the winter, but it's more appealing to me when it's warm.
Right, we're
Then
gonna
you
look
like
at
refreshing.
Yeah, I agree. I also like to put those sorts of things in hummus too. Maybe like carrot or cucumber sticks.
Then you promise someone bread sandwiches instead of making. Gotten used to it.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, that'll be a lot lower in
And
saturated
it makes
fat.
it good times. It's different times.
Yeah.
Roasted and more fun. Fire taste.
I'm right. So it's
Put it on the carrots and celery.
definitely agree. So I'm gonna move on now, but we can always come back to. I'd love to talk more about sort of what we like to eat. So yeah, my next slide is about flaxseeds. Which is funny. Yeah, you're already on the right track. So I wanted to talk about flaxseeds. There's been a lot of really interesting research with flaxseeds for hypertension. So they did things called randomized control trials. So in a randomized control trial, they have one group that gets the treatment and one group that doesn't get the treatment, but they don't know about it. They compare them and see what happens. And so in randomized control trials where they compared people that ate flax seeds and people who didn't eat flax seeds, they showed that flax seeds were actually as effective as some blood pressure lowering medications, which I thought was pretty cool because, in a dietary intervention like this, we're not going to have the same side effects as we do with medications, where, medications can be really helpful and really important, but you want to avoid them if possible, if there's a different way, because they can have dangerous side effects. The only side effect of eating flax seeds is maybe your cereal will taste a little more nutty. And it's best to eat ground flax seeds because
Those are not brown.
yeah, that picture, they're not ground. I want a prettier picture, but
You can buy them brown.
yeah, you can buy them already ground.
You don't need that brown.
Right, yeah, but they just get absorbed a little bit better when they're ground.
So better now, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you can buy a whole. You just might want to make sure that you're chewing them thoroughly, or
I use them for breads, I make better home.
That's great.
I put the flaxseeds in bread.
yeah,
That's
flax
all
seeds
I'm
are
gonna
great.
do.
That sounds really
But I
good.
don't grind it down. I just-
Right.
Yeah, you can even do a mix of some intact and some ground.
Enjoy
You
it.
like the way they taste it's fat. And
I have chia seeds too, but I don't know what they use for.
yeah, chia seeds are great. You can use something like a overnight oats and chia seeds.
Oh,
Salads.
Can you put chia seeds in food too, like bread?
Yeah, absolutely.
Look at that, I made it, I'll send it to them.
Yeah, chia seeds are pretty neutral tasting. I think you can throw them into those things as long as they find a texture.
Yeah.
get like a little bit gummy if you leave it overnight oats, which I don't mind too much. So yeah, and then you can also add flax seeds to things, yeah, like as we're talking about like breads or oatmeals or whatever else. They also don't have like strong taste. You taste it a bit, but I think they're pretty easy to add into foods without sort of feeling overwhelmed by the taste. And even just 2 tablespoons a day will get you to your daily needs for omega-3s. Omega-3s are those healthy fats that we've talked about, or that people talk about in relation to hypertension. And that's sort of why we think flax seeds are good for hypertension. They're still sort of figuring out the mechanism or why it works, but a lot of research has shown that it does. And we think it's because of the omega-3s in flax seeds. But that's sort of the interesting thing about researching foods, where you have all these different things interacting. So it's hard to say, you know, sometimes the whole is greater than some of its parts. But, you know, we know that this helps a lot and that it doesn't have any negative effects. So even if we don't fully understand why yet, it can only help. I think we have something in the chat, so I'm going to check the chat before moving on. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'll stand a little closer. They're telling me it's a little bit hard to hear, so I'm going to stay up here. That's okay?
That's fine.
How is it now?
It seems better when you're closer to the mic, so let's give it a try.
Okay, I'll
Thank
stay right
you.
here then. Yeah, no problem. So let's see. And I can go back at the end too to any slides that were difficult to hear.
That's okay, your slides are good. That's why I hung in there.
Okay, I appreciate that. And so I also wanted to talk about hibiscus tea. Well, hibiscus in general, but usually people put it in tea. So hibiscus is a flower that has very powerful effects. It has been shown to be as effective as at lowering blood pressure as captopril, which is one of the leading blood pressure drugs out there. And it also helps lower bad cholesterol, so it lowers risk of heart attacks and triglycerides, so it might help weight control. You just want to be careful with very, very high doses of hibiscus. By very, very high doses, I would say going beyond like 6 cups a day. Yeah, hibiscus tea, you can find it in most grocery stores. It's great, and they have it mixed into a lot of sort of very fruity herbal teas. You might already be drinking a tea that has hibiscus in there without realizing. But we think that hibiscus tea helps because it has these compounds called anthocyanins. Anthocyanins make foods sort of, or plant foods red or purple. So we also find them in things like blueberries or purple potatoes or red cabbage. So eating these foods too, you might also get some of this beneficial effect. I don't know, like to the best of my knowledge, I don't think that these foods have been tested for hypertension effects, but it can only help, again, to eat more red cabbage or to eat purple potatoes. So hibiscus tea is really great. They've done head-to-head trials comparing it to blood pressure lowering drugs, and I genuinely just enjoy the taste. I think it's great. It's very fruity. I don't ever feel the need to sweeten it at all because I think it's very flavorful on its own, and it's relatively cheap. I mean, it's around the same cost as most other teas you see in the supermarket. You could probably buy a box of 20 tea bags for about $2. I think they might also sell some fresh. People grow hibiscus flowers in their garden as well. I imagine there's other culinary uses for it. I usually just see it as a tea, but I can dive into what else is out there. And I wanted to talk about beets as well. I thought it was interesting when Hannah was talking before, she was saying that they are going to have beets coming up in their CSA. So that could be great. Maybe get some beets from Just Roots. So beets have been also studied a lot. There were actually 43 different trials comparing beets for hypertension, which is huge. We don't usually get that much research for food. So I thought that was pretty exciting. So essentially the idea is beets provide nitric oxide, which is a helpful compound in food that helps open up the arteries. So like we talked about before with hypertension, it's how small your arteries are and how much your heart is putting out. That's what increases your blood pressure. So when your arteries are bigger and more open, like when you eat beets, it helps the blood to flow, and so you don't have as high blood pressure. And so we think that this is the mechanism by which beets lower blood pressure. It's been researched a lot, so this one we know with a bit more certainty. And beets are actually also really good for athletes. If you're into running or working out in general, it can be great to eat a bunch of beets before a workout. It might help with your stamina. You get a lot of oxygen a lot more easily, so you can kind of keep going, keep working out for a little longer because you're getting more oxygen, so you don't wear out as quickly. So,
What about things like pickle beets? Are those okay?
like what?
I like pickle beets. Are those okay to eat?
Yeah, I think those are okay to eat. I would just keep an eye out for the salt content or what's being added to the pickling juice. But the pickling process itself isn't harmful. It just matters what else is in there with the
And
beets.
beet soup is very good too.
Yeah, beet soup is excellent. I love borscht.
I love it too.
Yeah,
Beet greens, I love.
yeah, beet greens are great too. I think they would also have a lot of nitric oxide. You can also do roasted beets if you're not into sort of the sliminess of them. I don't mind raw beets, but it's not everyone's cup of tea. And yeah, there are a lot of other cool beet preparation methods. So let's see. Do we have any other questions about our superfoods before I go on? So we've talked about flax seeds, hibiscus, and beets. Okay, so yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, we have to go out for lunch after this. So I also wanted to talk about, all of this is great. You hear all this and you think, wow, that sounds cool, but I could never do that. And I just sort of wanted to address some of the obstacles people have to eating plant-based, because I think a lot of people think, oh, well, that's great for you, but I could never. And I just sort of wanted to break some of those down and see if we could figure out new ways. So we have taste preferences, we have convenience, we have on the nutrition side, people are worried about protein and iron. We have cultural practices. People might, for their cultures, eat foods that aren't fully plant-based. And a lot of people think being plant-based is expensive. So what can we think of for sort of how to address these issues? As we were talking about before, your taste changes over time. As you were saying, switching from putting mayonnaise on sandwiches to hummus, you got used to the taste after a while. And that's actually very common. So our taste buds change, people don't realize, based on what foods we're eating a lot. So if you get used to eating a certain way for, let's say, a month, and you're eating that way for a month and you really stick to it and you work through it, your taste buds will change and you'll start to like those foods.
Right.
And then there is also convenience. It can be tricky. There's not always plant-based options when you go out to eat. It's been getting better, but it's still tricky, especially depending on what part of the country you live in. But if you like to cook, it can help a lot to meal prep and plan ahead and do that sort of thing. There's also more convenient options for cooking, using things like canned beans, as long as they don't have sodium or you rinse it off, or things like instant oats, which can cook up pretty quickly. You just really boil water and add it. And there's sort of different strategies you can do where you do batch cooking and just make a bunch, maybe on like a Sunday when you have more free time, and then eat that food throughout the week. And then for protein and iron, I think in the US, we have a lot of mythology around protein. We always think of it as being very, very important. And while it is important, I think a lot of Americans don't realize protein deficiency is actually pretty rare in the Western world.
Okay.
We do see protein deficiency in the world. It's very common in, let's say, third world countries such as rural Africa, where people are eating diets that are mostly just corn or mostly just rice, because they're just not eating enough calories, they're not eating a variety of foods.
Right.
But most people, except for those with, let's say, chronic diseases who they've been told by their doctor or by their dietitian, you have higher needs for protein. For the average person, a protein deficiency is very rare. And plant-based foods also have a lot of protein, especially if you're eating a lot of whole grains, you're eating a lot of beans, and you're having a variety. We used to think you had to mix and match plant foods to make sure you were getting a certain amount of protein every meal. We're now realizing that's not true, as long as you're eating a variety of plant foods in general. And then people worry about iron. Iron is a concern. Iron deficiency is actually pretty common in the US. It's actually relatively common among both plant-based eaters and omnivores. So it's an issue that's not necessarily dependent exclusively on being plant-based, but also just generally, the standard American diet can also be iron deficient. And in plant foods, you can also get iron from things like whole grains, legumes, and even things like dried fruit, apricots and raisins even have a bit of iron in them, which is interesting. And then for cultural practices, I think it's important to keep in mind that it isn't all or nothing. So if you have a certain holiday that you love to celebrate with your family, and at that holiday, your mother bakes her fresh chocolate chip cookies every year and you just can't not have one, that's okay. That's what you eat for one day. That's not what you eat every single day.
Right.
And I think we need to be realistic with ourselves about what works for our own lives. And then in terms of cost as well, there are ways to eat a plant-based diet that are cheaper. Doing things like joining a CSA is a really great option, or buying things in bulk. You know, a lot of stores, you can buy a ton of brown rice or black beans or that sort of thing all at once and save it as long as you have the storage space. But there are a lot of organizations working towards this and working towards eating a more plant-based diet and trying to make it cheaper. I think it's been getting more and more accessible, which is exciting. It can still be a little expensive when you go out to eat, but I think in general going out to eat is a little more expensive. Is there anything else we can think of that would make eating plant-based difficult? So I think you can consume some dairy and eggs and still be considered plant-based. I think the thing about plant-based that people don't realize is it's a little bit different from vegan in that we're focusing on what you are eating, not on what you're cutting out. So if you eat some animal products every once in a while, you're still plant-based as long as you're trying to focus on eating whole plant foods. For things like vegan, it's almost more of a ethical practice of excluding all animal products. You know, there are junk food vegans out there eating things like vegan donuts for breakfast and vegan mac and cheese for dinner, and that's not a whole lot better than eating the standard American diet. It's still very high in refined sugars and flours and things. But when you're eating plant-based, you're trying to eat a lot of whole plant foods. So if you're going to eat some dairy, you're going to eat some eggs, that doesn't make you not plant-based. I have some experience in dairy and eggs. I worry with dairy about there are certain compounds that may increase cancer rates with dairy. It depends. They're more active, I think, in things like whole milk than in yogurt. You also want to be careful with potentially, if you are eating dairy, to choose low-fat dairy, things that are lower in saturated fat. I personally don't consume dairy. I also think it puts a strain on the digestive system. A lot of people don't digest lactose very well, mainly because the human body isn't really meant to. We're the only species that drinks the milk of another animal. And I think to an extent, our body isn't fully designed for it, but we've adapted to do that because we have been doing it for a couple generations. With eggs, I think eating local eggs can be beneficial. It depends on the diet of the chicken. Eggs do often have carotenoids. And I would recommend, something like an egg over something like a really processed, like breakfast sausage sort of thing. So I think it exists on a spectrum. I think you can eat those foods in moderation and not have it be an issue and generally have a healthy pattern if it's important to you to include those in your diet. I think
I don't think I could pull that.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's foods that are really, that you really like.
Yeah,
Or a
absolutely.
little bit on things.
Yeah, and I think moving towards a healthy diet pattern, it's not about what you can sustain being really, really strict for a week. It's about what you think is realistic for you for the rest of your life. And so I think it's really important that you are honest with yourself and say, I'm not going to cut out cheese. And,
But just
me or somebody else, a dietitian, would say, that's okay. That's how you want to eat. And I'm here to work with you on what you think works for you.
I've read that Swiss cheese is better for you than some other cheeses.
Yeah, definitely. There's a spectrum of sort of how good various cheeses are for you, looking at things like saturated fat. So big fresh cheeses, things like mozzarella, generally tend to be a little bit better than something very processed with a lot of additives, things like cheddar cheese or whatever else. Yeah, do we have any other thoughts on obstacles or other foods we're confused about? Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to end on a bit of a positive note. Going back to what we were actually just talking about, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So if you are not eating 100% all plant-based foods, all healthy foods all the time, that's okay. I personally do adhere to a vegan diet 100% of the time for environmental reasons, but I still eat unhealthy foods here and there. I'll have my vegan ice cream or my refined baguettes or whatever else because I like them. And eating healthy isn't about being super strict with yourself or beating yourself up every time you eat something that's bad. It's about being honest with yourself about how much of that you're going to indulge in and checking in with yourself about what's realistic. And so even if you're eating just one or two more servings of whole plant foods a day, that's still a vast improvement and goes beyond what a lot of people are doing out there. You know, one serving of vegetables a day can make a difference in your health. And it's about keeping up the habit daily and sustaining it and doing it beyond, you know, a short period of time where you're really interested in it and then forgetting about it. But I think the more realistic you are with yourself, the easier it is to stick with it long term.
This time of year, we've got this advantage of the fresh
Right,
vegetables coming through. You're in area, your farm stands, you have like, oh, people with gardens.
Absolutely.
You want to just buy it, it's there.
Yeah, this area is excellent for that.
Right.
You have an advantage.
Yeah, there's a lot of really amazing tasting things out there. The really fresh foods, I think nothing can compare this time of year when you're in season.
Just starting to get off the ground. Strawberries coming in too, and strawberries.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited for strawberry season.
Blueberries too.
Coming up. Blueberries, and then a little later in the summer, peaches. I really love peaches, but they're not so good out of season.
What about fresh corn when it comes out?
Fresh corn is good. Yeah, you just want to be careful about what you're adding to your corn, what seasonings you're using.
Salt and butter.
Yeah, a lot of people use a ton of salt and butter, so you want to be careful about what else you're putting on there. There's a lot of other spices you can do instead of salt. I like to do even a little bit of cayenne pepper because I like a little bit of spice. Or if you still want some sort of like, not buttery component, but I guess sort of liquid component to make it a little less dry. I even like to do a little bit of lime. That's sort of a similar thing that they do to, yeah.
When the corn is sweet enough, you don't need sugar, I don't know, sugar. You don't need butter, you don't need anything, corn, it's really sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. Corn is very sweet.
Sometimes you don't.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
about canned salmon? I love salmon. I buy a couple times a month, I buy fresh salmon.
Okay. I would be
Couple
careful with
meals out of it. Once in I buy a can once in a while.
I buy that too, the canned salmon's good, tastes good.
yeah, I would be careful with eating too much of that, but I think every once in a while
I love potassium in it.
it does have potassium, that's true. There has been, I think I was touching on the Nurses Health study a bit ago that showed eating a lot of canned salmon had a bit of an association with hypertension. They haven't studied it that much. It's not something we don't know. It's hard to sometimes these things with association. We don't know if it's cause and effect. But I would be a little bit careful with eating a crazy amount of it, but I wouldn't say it's something you have to cut out. Just, I wouldn't go beyond, let's say, 2 servings a week of it, and maybe space those out on different days, so you're not getting
Yeah, I
too
get
much at once.
several lunches or a salad out of it, or make some patties.
Yeah.
What's in these, just for me, my
Yeah.
son lives, he doesn't like salmon, so I have
Okay.
the whole thing. And
Yeah.
that salmon, fine.
Yeah, and if you want to pair it with whole plant foods too, you could serve your salmon with like a bed of brown rice or with some spinach or
And
with
it's
garlic.
also, yeah, with the big salad, it's really, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with a mix of plant foods, it is bad in and of itself. I would just caution against, you know, having a ton of it or having that as a staple thing that you eat every single day.
No.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
I was saying something about fresh salmon and frozen salmon, it really doesn't matter, does it?
I don't think it makes much of a difference nutritionally. There might be a few nutrients that are
Size
altered.
wise, it's a big difference, so I
Exactly.
just frozen salmon, 4-ounce piece, compared to buying it fresh.
Yeah, I think that's a fair trade-off, you know?
Gotta buy the wild caught, not the farm raised.
Right, yeah, the wild caught's gonna have a lot more helpful compounds because it's going to be
Farm
eating.
raised right there.
real plants. Right, yeah, I mean, they're just eating, you know, factory-made pellets when they're
Yeah.
farm raised.
Right.
So yeah, those are all the slides I have. I included some of my sources. If anybody wanted me to email some of the study user research that I was talking about, I'd be happy to do that. I was able to access a ton of research through PubMed through my UMass account. A lot of these files, I think if you click on these links, you might not be able to access them, but I have all the PDFs downloaded myself, so I could just forward them along to whoever is interested in reading more. They're a little bit dense. I, prefer doing a PowerPoint over sort of sharing these articles. They're very scientific journal articles, a lot of very dense information that It's a little bit, yeah, it's a little tricky if you're not very interested in the science behind it, but you know, I like to cite my sources. I think it's important that people remain credible because there's a lot of bad research out there. There's a lot of, you know, sort of information that doesn't tell the whole story. So I just wanted to be transparent about where I'm getting my information from. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have prepared. Do we have any other, actually, do we have any ideas for a next meeting? I was thinking about continuing this as a series, but
That was the next thing.
it wouldn't be until July. I would have to talk to Jayne about figuring out an exact day to make it happen. It depends on the Y schedule.
Okay.
I don't really get to control it, but
I don't know, I just, you know, when I joined the blood pressure thing, she said.
It was like coming up.
What, on Saturday, so I think,
yeah,
I don't know,
I
she
think
said, I
there's a-
guess it's gonna be 4 of them. or 3 or 4.
yeah, it's meant to be sort of a series. I think there's sort of a once a month event, so the next one probably won't be for another month or so.
Okay.
I know they're recording this right now, so you can also access today's meeting as well, and I don't mind sharing out my slide set as well. But yeah, I'm hoping to lead another meeting like this, and keep going in sort of the world of plant-based. I also work at a plant-based restaurant, and we have a demo kitchen.
Right.
So I was talking to my boss the other day about potentially us getting in there to do a cooking demonstration with,
Where do you work?
I work at Pulse Cafe in Hadley.
You bring us some recipes?
I can try, yeah, and it's funny, we actually also serve at Hibiscus.
Bring the food, okay?
Yeah.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, it's interesting, and
Yeah.
just trying to, like you said, add some things to your, you don't think about it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I also,
Not a little that's easy to, like, add some carrots or add
It's a little extra effort to be working.
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, even small changes will make a big difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I can also share my email with Jayne. I don't know. I was hoping to just write my email on a whiteboard or something, but I guess there isn't anything. Oh, there is.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I'll
There's
go to
more
all the classes.
Homework.
That's the question. Well, my email is acrest, A-S-E-C.
I don't have to do that.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I'll come to all the classes.
Okay.
If Jayne lets me know. I'll come
Yeah.
back.
I'll tell Jayne that she can share out my email if she likes.
Tell Mike, once in all the classes.
I don't know,
Okay.
I think.
Sounds good. I'll tell her that Mike wants to come to all the classes. So,
Okay.
yeah. Thank you guys so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I think that's it. I don't want to end the meeting in case anybody else had any, or if anybody has any last thoughts. I'm going to end the meeting in a second. If I can figure out how to use Zoom, this is not my computer, so it gets interesting.